This is Dr. Kathy Millhauser with a lecture on resistance to change. Anyone who has tried to institute a new procedure in the workplace, implement a new system, or change the way that work is done for the benefit of the organization knows that change does not happen easily for most. One of the most baffling questions in organizational life is, why do people resist change? Organizational leaders who have experience leading change efforts tell stories of teams that not only resist change, but also maneuver around it or even attempt to undermine changes that would be to their benefit. Logical attempts to institute change often are met with quite illogical responses. Understanding why people resist change is critical to anyone who hopes to build an organization that truly embraces uncertainty. Although the psychological and social dynamics that contribute to change resistance are vast, there are a few things we know about organizational behavior that can shed some light on this phenomena. People naturally resist anything that is outside of their control. At the deepest level, individuals have a need for control of things that affect them. No one wants to be trapped, and most of us become quite illogical and emotional when we are backed into a corner. Change that is imposed on people can invoke quite violent resistance, purely because of the psychological effect of losing control. Conversely, we are an inquisitive species, and the grass is indeed always greener on the other side of the fence. So, change that is induced in an individual because they see that there is a better way to do things and that adapting their behavior is in their own best interests is quite natural. Therefore, change that is induced internally instead of imposed externally is bound to be met with less resistance. One of the most basic needs we have as human beings is the need to belong. We belong to a family, we belong to a culture, and we belong to groups that we associate with in our personal and professional lives. All of these associations participate in the formation and sustenance of our identity. That identity creates a sense of security that tells us who we are and that we are not alone. This need for belonging can translate into extremely strong teams in the workplace, when identity is reinforced by being a member of the team, where values are shared, mindsets about how things ought to be are strengthened, and individuals feel like they are part of something larger than themselves and that they believe in. This sounds like a great setup for change, an organization filled with high-performing and highly motivated teams. And yet these high-performing teams are often the ones that resist change most violently. The reason might lie in whether the change is coming from inside or outside the team. Groups form identities by creating boundaries between themselves and outsiders. In fact, one of the ways for a group to become clear on the behaviors that are acceptable for membership is to reinforce the behaviors that are unacceptable to the group. Most of us have heard the phrase, "what this team needs is a common enemy," in the workplace. Threats to a group's identity are frequently galvanizing forces that bring teams together as if they were building a wall around their territory in an attempt to defend it. High-performing teams have very clear, and almost always unwritten, rules for behavior and criteria for who is in and who is out of the team. Ask anyone who has joined a team and struggled to be accepted. It is not always clear what the rules are for how new members are meant to behave, but it often becomes very clear when one of those rules is broken. Boundaries form as groups strengthen their identity by reinforcing acceptable and unacceptable behaviors and creating clear distinctions between the behaviors of the in-group and those of the out-group. Change that threatens these boundaries will be resisted, often before it is even thoroughly examined. It is not the content of the change that is the problem. It is simply the fact that the change is being imposed from outside the group boundaries that creates initial resistance. Organizational mindsets are formed by the way that things worked in the past. We have all heard the phrase, "it has always been done this way." Our natural response to the person saying this might be that they are just resistant to change. But why do they think this way? Studies have shown that the behaviors of organizational founders often become legendary in the stories that are told for decades to follow. These stories form mindsets that reinforce how a person is meant to behave in the organization. The old-timers in the organization have seen the change fads come and go. What has lasted has been the culture that they have increasingly learned to cling to, and in clinging to it, they have strengthened and reinforced it. For the newer employees, these legends and stories become larger than life as they strive to make sense of how to be successful in the organization, how to become legendary themselves. These mindsets are hard to see and even harder to track to their source, but any anthropologist will tell you that the effect of tribal knowledge and oral history on a society is profound. The typical response to the problem of change resistance is to institute programs to convince people that the change being implemented is good. The irony of this approach is that the change management program itself becomes an external force that has the potential to invoke the resistance response. It is essential to remember that anything that threatens individual or group identity by coming from outside is going to be met with a natural resistance response. Whether the change is clearly for the better or not will be decided by the individuals and groups affected by the change. Change happens from the inside out. So what can organizational leaders do? The first step is to understand why change is so often resisted. The next is to design change initiatives that demonstrate and leverage this understanding. If imposing change on people, whether it is for their own good or not, creates a natural response of resistance, then it is only logical that we would involve those individuals in defining the change. For whatever reason, this is rarely done well in organizations. The enlightened change management team might interview some end users or change targets to see what their needs are, but they then typically go off to a conference room somewhere for weeks or even months to design the change effort based on that input. Even more enlightened change management teams might pull individuals out of their normal work setting to participate in the change effort, again going off to a conference room to design the change, but this time taking representatives of the change target group along with them. This would seem to be a good approach, as it engages individuals as team members in defining change. But remember what we learned about group identity. There is a statute of limitations for how long a group member can be gone from a group before they become part of the out group instead of the in group. They quickly become part of the external threat to the group and no longer part of the team that will be affected by the change. The following 3 strategies can help you design change inside the target group instead of outside of it, thus eliminating the need to implement change. The first strategy is to embed change agents inside the teams. One of the challenges to the approach of engaging individuals and teams in defining their own change is the skill gap. A group of individuals with the mission to build software or design products will not typically have training or experience in leading processes to facilitate change. The role of change agent becomes essential in guiding the team through this process. However, if the change agent comes from outside of the group, they are once again part of that external force that the group boundaries have formed resistance to. The group may be passively polite and cooperative during the change workshop, but the change agent and leadership sponsor will generally be baffled a week or a month later when they find out that the group is not implementing their own change plan. Why? Because the change agent was not part of the team. Consider instead what happens when a change agent is embedded inside the team. They go through the process of adapting to group norms, defining an identity with the group, and developing a sense of urgency for why the team needs to change. They come to the change effort with change leadership skills and the external orientation that helps them see why change is needed. As they become part of the group, they develop a sense of belonging and understanding of group needs that helps them bridge the gap between the internal realities of the team and the external forces that they need to adapt to. This change agent, when accepted by the group as an in-group member, has a powerful ability to lead change from the inside. Another strategy is to create externally focused teams that understand what is needed to be successful inside their boundaries while keeping their eyes focused on the external landscape. This strategy works well in knowledge worker teams where expertise in processing information is relatively high. For example, in product development teams that are tuned in to their consumer or customer needs. If a team has a strong group identity based on a shared understanding of why they exist, what they need to do to thrive, and what their boundaries for behavior are, and that team can be distributed so that they are focused on a variety of markets, they have the potential to bring significant insights from the external environment back to the team. Organizations that are doing this well have found these teams to be extraordinarily adaptable to change and quick to respond to opportunities. The challenge for leaders interested in developing this type of team is to ensure that communication and coordination of these team members receives the highest priority and reinforcement. Organizational leaders in this type of distributed environment are no longer challenged with deciding what needs to change or with sponsoring and driving change efforts. Instead, they are challenged with motivating, aligning, and ensuring coordination of distributed change leaders in highly dynamic teams. The next strategy is to communicate in alignment with your organizational mindset. Regardless of the approach chosen by organizational leaders, it continues to be essential that communication inside and across the change effort is aligned with the organizational mindset. Consider an organization that has been in place for many years and has cultural artifacts that communicate a solid, stable, and consistent approach to business based on integrity and honesty. How might this organization respond to a change campaign that tells them that the world is changing and we have to quickly adapt, be fluid and dynamic? If the message is in conflict with the experiences of the past as well as the behaviors that have been rewarded and memorialized, it will be considered artificial and dishonest. Clearly, there would be a disconnect between the experience of being in this organization and the expectations of the change, which again comes across as dishonest and reinforces the belief that the change is a threat to not only the individual, but the integrity of the organization. No amount of logic is going to convince individuals in organizations like this to change, and furthermore, approaches like this will taint the change effort with an air of dishonesty. Change messages must be aligned to the organizational realities. Better yet, change messages should be communicated from inside out, as individuals, groups, and the organization at large assess what needs to change, design their response, and communicate their success stories as contributions to the evolving organizational mindset. Organizational leaders have many challenges with change initiatives, some of them at the individual and group level and many of them organization-wide. Creating a climate of change readiness is a long-term change effort in itself. By working through the process of first understanding change resistance and second considering strategies to increase the likelihood of change being accepted, leaders are well on their way to seeing an increase in the success rate of change implementation. Getting started can be challenging, especially with the need to change immediately and the sense that there is no time to influence something so vast as the embedded mindsets and group behaviors in place in the organization. The solution? Start small. Find a team to start with and approach change in a different way. Look for small wins that will allow new stories to be told in the organization as teams that adapt to change are rewarded and new behaviors and mindsets are reinforced. Celebrate successes and make constant communication a top priority. And most importantly, consider changing yourself. Listen to your organization and the teams that are successfully engaging in change. What do they need from their leadership? The change that is most needed may be a change in the way that organizations are led. When you find that you are following more than you are leading, as your organization learns to sense what is happening around it and is telling you that they need to change, you probably are on the right track. I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture on resistance to change and will consider trying some of these techniques in the next change effort that you are involved with. Thank you for your attention.